Council President.
Okay. Thank you to everybody who came out tonight. I'm going to use my time to address something unrelated because after we finish the vote here, everyone's going to leave, and then. But I want you all to hear this so that it's here for the public record as well, and for all of you to hear kind of what's going on in City Hall in that respect. So for those of you who may tune in to JCTV, you'll see at the caucus at around 10:05 p.m. last night that I raised some issues with regard to hires that the council people were trying to make. Hiring council aides at $15,000, council aides who get paid $15,000 a year. Each of us, we have an aide, and we're all part-time council people who get paid $35,000 comparatively to Newark, where they make $80,000 to $90,000 per council person and have 4 staffers. Our one aide, $15,000. Some of us have recently tried to hire aides, and I say recently over the past several weeks, mine the most recent, and some of us also tried to hire student interns, multiple interns that get paid $15 an hour at 20 hours a week. Because of differences on some of the issues and some of the votes, all of those hires which had to be approved by the administration were held up. And I raised that last night and made an issue of it and urged the council members that we needed to let them know that it was unacceptable and it was vindictive and mean for them to hold that up and for people's livelihoods, people who really are just doing this for the love of doing public service, and they're not even able to make less than minimum wage in doing this job because this administration won't approve it. So I want the council to know, because I don't think they know this at this point, but almost all of those student interns and assistants and council aides were approved, all except mine, right? So coming into tonight, mine still sits exactly where it was last night, but there was a rush to approve everybody else's. And that's because I've been very vocal as of late, and somebody mentioned it, Kristen, you mentioned that, am I making a run for mayor at this point? No, that's actually not the case, right? I'm just kind of fed up with kind of the nonsense that goes on. And it's nonsense like that. If folks remember my first year in office, stories about my car being towed as retribution for not being able to fall in line with the administration on things. And so folks know that I put out another proposal. It wasn't intended necessarily to, that I didn't feel like we needed to fund our children, but I actually thought that there was an alternative solution. And the reason being, as other people have cited, that as we've had conversations with representatives of the business community, that there was strong opposition to that. And so the idea that the business community would oppose it, and oppose it when this vote is done. And so what's likely to happen after this, what may happen, maybe not sure, there might be a referendum, just like with the Katian Memorial statue, petitions issued and asking people to oppose and rescind the ordinance. If enough petitions are gathered, just like with the statue, they will then, it'll come back to the city council and we'll either have to rescind the ordinance or let it go to referendum. Most likely if that happens, and if they were to initiate that, it will likely happen and it'll end up going to referendum. And so, as Councilman Yun said, there'll necessarily be a fight. And so folks will have to fight to be able to make sure that the referendum gets passed to keep the ordinance on the books in that regard. That being said, the other thing was that there'll be a lawsuit likely. A lawsuit to rescind the ordinance or to hold it and have an injunction against it because there'll be grounds raised about the constitutionality of the payroll tax itself. I won't get into the legal things about that, but all of that may delay the actual implementation and rollout of the collection of dollars to be able to put that into the budget for the schools in a timely manner for the 2019-2020 school year. And so my effort there was to try to strike a compromise, to be able to ensure that we were able to get the dollars into the school budget. As I said at last night's caucus, and for folks who know how the bad hit I took in this election cycle recently, like I'm not afraid of the fight, and I'm not afraid when I'm under-resourced to stand up and take the fight. But my feeling was that, like, rather than roll the dice and take the chance, why don't we try to do a compromise and try to figure and have everyone sitting at the table, working together with the business community to try to find a solution that we can all live with at that point moving forward and make sure our schools are funded. That effort, I attempted to do that with yesterday's caucus meeting, posted some information about that, shared that with my colleagues. That effort failed. I've always said, going long before this payroll tax, before the cuts, that whatever we needed to do, I wasn't opposed to giving money from the city's budget itself and doing that legally and doing that the proper way. And I still have no opposition to that, and I'm willing to completely do that. And when people suggested that my proposal to put non-recurring revenues, such as Port Authority settlement money and Jersey City Medical settlement money, and dedicating some $22 million to our education trust fund, I actually tweeted that out before any of these meetings happened when we first voted for the Jersey City Medical Center's pilot settlement agreement money. So I've said, show me your budget, and I'll show you your priorities. And so I get it, there's a crisis, and so I'm prepared, and I'd ask my council, going forward, that we actually do allocate those monies, because those are found money. They're not intended to balance our budget, and if they were, then somebody else wasn't sharing information with the city council as to what the uses would be and what they were anticipating for their budget going forward, meaning the administration. So I still stand by that proposal in that respect. My concern, beyond just the challenge of whether we'll be able to get the money collected and get it into the schools so that we don't have a big $25 million budget deficit in the 2019-20, is, as a young lady said, Scholastica Okuye, that there needs to be more study. I will be the first person. I mean, if you saw some of the business and industry folks who came up here, I've seen them before. You know why? Because I introduced the ordinance several years ago to establish a 30-hour minimum work week for maintenance people and security guards who work in tax-abated buildings. And the reason being at that time was that Obamacare required that if you had 30 hours or more in a work week, you had to give them health care. And their hours were getting cut below 30 hours and into the 20-hour range and so forth. So I tried to put an ordinance out, and at that time, our progressive mayor wasn't necessarily in support of that and was oddly silent on being able to provide health care for those workers. And so I saw many of those industry folks and spoke to them then about all of that. And they expressed their displeasure. That measure never passed. I'm also the same guy when we introduced earned sick days, which this mayor touts and says that first in the nation, and we were all part of that, myself, Councilperson Waterman and Councilman Rivera, how we were all part of that process in establishing Jersey City as the first city in the state of New Jersey to establish earned sick days. And when small businesses and business communities said, balked at that whole thing, and initially when we put it out there, the mayor wanted to be 10 or more employees. I was the person who was pushing for all businesses, irregardless of size, recognizing the importance that health care and sick days provided to all employees. We ultimately started with 10 or more employees, and we did a study as part of that introduction because we wanted to see what the impact would be. And yet we have no study for a payroll tax that's being implemented here. So we don't know what the economic impact will be ultimately. If you speak to the business community, they'll suggest that the sky is falling on that. I'd probably say it's not as bad as that, but there's probably going to be some impact. And we're probably going to see a loss of jobs, and if I'm wrong, I hope I'm wrong. But we don't have the small business exemptions. We're going to need to work that out and work to the state. But all of this was kind of rushed through because somebody in Trenton had an agenda to cut Jersey City's school budgets by $175 million. If there was a mistake I made, and I remember discussing with one of the activists out here, Ms. Bridget D'Souza, and she was asking me about kind of where we're at, and I talked about the idea that discussions were very tenuous, and I couldn't really speak a lot very openly about it and give out a whole lot of details. And I really felt that way because we were trying to balance a lot of different needs at the time, and folks were very litigious, to say the least, on that. right? So we're trying to keep everybody at the table in discussions. Well, if I had to look back on this, I'd probably say my mistake going back 4 or 5 months in this process at this point was to not just bring everyone to the table and say, let's have everybody sit down and figure this out and open up the doors, and I won't make that mistake again going forward. One of our speakers talked about how he was a Jersey City resident and an engineer, and that we're now fighting for the same things from decades ago. And so when I heard that and the idea that little has changed, and so this payroll tax, while it will fund and fill some of the gap left by the state deficit, what I proposed was the idea that what this payroll tax doesn't do, and what it was not intended to do, it did exactly what it's supposed to do, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't change the dynamics of our education here in Jersey City. And as George Fontanet said earlier tonight, that the idea that on the South Side, I'm the guy who was talking about the South Side and how it's been underserved and how we have our greatest challenges, and that we need to, as we have done with our policing strategy, dedicate police resources and said we have more police in the South and West districts, in the Greenville section, wards F, A, and B, than we have in any part of the city. It's because that's where the highest need is. That's where the highest crime is. And I would say the same thing about our education, that we need to make sure that our resources are dedicated to those areas that are most in need. And so this does nothing, while it provides the resources and the basic, barely, not even the minimum resources, but just kind of inches us up towards that. It doesn't do anything to address that particular need. And we're going to need to do that going forward. And so someone asked the question, finally, what are we going to do after this? Well, I hope that maybe there isn't a referendum and that there's not going to be a big fight, but people should gear up for that. And for my part, I made my pitch, I made my effort, and it didn't work. I'll lick my wounds, and I'm a big boy. I'll get myself back up off the ground, and I'll join the fight, because we need to keep that money and fight for our kids here in Jersey City. And then I'm going to focus like a laser on making sure that we do what we need to do to make sure that we not just have the resources, but we have more than adequate resources, and in particular for the Greenville section that I grew up in, and making sure that our children there who are most under-resourced and are most in need, that we make sure that they get the highest quality education, because while it was great, and I thank all of the parents and children who came out, I noticed that there weren't a lot of folks from the South Side of Jersey City coming out here with their children as well. And that underrepresentation and that lack of participation, that's also reflected in how we allocate our resources, and that desperately needs to change, and I'm going to be fighting to make sure that that happens as we move forward on these education funding issues. So with that, I'm all in. Let's make sure that we keep moving forward, and I vote aye.